Hello everyone, welcome to today's SilverlightShow webinar. My name is Ivan and I'm pleased to introduce today Brian Noyes, who will deliver his next session from the series of WCF RIA Services. This session will be dedicated to security and personalization with WCF RIA Services. Brian, shall we start?
Yeah, all set. All right, thanks, Ivan. Okay, welcome everyone. As you know, this session's about security in Silverlight apps. Just to kind of set the stage here or set expectations, as you can see that part of the focus here will be on WCF RIA Services, but if you have looked at RIA Services and kind of looked at its way of doing service calls and stuff and decided that part is not for you, this can still be completely relevant for you because the security features of RIA Services really complement what RIA Services does, but can be used in isolation of the rest of RIA Services as well. And we'll talk about broad concepts of security around Silverlight apps as a starting point. For a little background on myself here, I am with iDesign. We're a .NET architecture and design consulting and training company. I'm also a Microsoft Regional Director for the Mid-Atlantic region. That's basically Washington, D.C. and the surrounding states. And I'm also a Silverlight MVP. Do a lot of writing and speaking. The important stuff here is my contact information. Do feel free to contact me offline if you have follow-up questions. The structure of the webinar here is I'll be presenting mostly demos for about the next 50 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes of Q&A at the end of it. But if you don't get your questions answered there, you can feel free to contact me offline by one of these means at the bottom. And the slides for the presentation are already available out on the site where you got linked in from, but if you need to follow up on that, just contact me. And the demos that I'll be doing will get uploaded as well, and I'll do a blog post on briannoyes.net with those demos as well. All right, so don't seem to be sequencing. There we go. Overall, the flow that I'll go through here is first talk about security in general in Silverlight applications, then a quick overview of RIA Services for those that have not tuned into a previous show or read my article series and just need the big picture of what RIA Services is about. And then we'll dive into the heart of the matter, which is using the RIA functionality to give you a secure end-to-end authentication and authorization scenario for both the client and server side of your application. Then after that, we'll talk briefly about also introducing some more personalization information. Once you know who the user is, you can start to have additional features light up based on their preferences and things like that. And then towards the end, we'll also talk about once you've got your Silverlight app up and running and personalized and secured, what about when it starts making calls out to services? And we'll talk briefly about when they're RIA services, WCF RIA service domain services, how you secure things on that side, and also how you can share that same security context calling out to other WCF or HTTP-based services. So at a high level, the things that we're really looking at, security means many things to many people. So I just wanted to start and couch what I'm focusing on in this talk. And that is, first off, you usually want to protect access to your Silverlight app, meaning you don't want any user to fire up your app and use its functionality. You need to block access and make sure only authorized users are allowed to fire up the app and get to its functionality or some subset of the functionality. The other thing is that when the Silverlight app calls out to services, as I just mentioned, you want those calls to be secure as well, and you often need to share a security context or a session, if you will, between the Silverlight app, the hosting website, and the services that it calls out to. And then the last piece is once you know who the user is, then you want to start customizing the functionality of the application based on that user. Now, when it comes to Silverlight itself, you kind of have a warm security blanket, if you will, that surrounds your application if you want to use it. I am primarily focusing in this talk on Silverlight apps that are going to be delivered via the web. Now, you can still go out of browser, and I'll touch on that as well, but I'm assuming the initial deployment mode of your Silverlight app and possibly its primary usage is by having that Silverlight app hosted in a web page. Now, once you go out of browser, there are ways to install completely out of browser and never even launch from a web page. Things get a little more complex there in terms of what your security context is, because then you're launching totally local machine and you're not automatically affiliated with any particular server. So at that point, you would have to collect credentials and just do authentication against the services you call out to, but the Silverlight app itself would not be secured. What I'm focusing on here is more the web-hosted scenario. So when you are delivering your Silverlight app via a web page, that web page itself is coming from a web server. The web server has security mechanisms of its own, and the primary forms there that we're probably used to if you've dealt with ASP.NET at all is that you can either be Windows-based or forms authentication-based are the two primary modes. Now there are more complicated scenarios, security scenarios with things like federated identity and stuff that Silverlight in general can support with some other extensions outside of the Silverlight bubble. But we're just going to focus on the 90% case here with mostly forms authentication, but also would apply to Windows authentication as well. And so the idea is that the hosting application, the host website, can provide all the security you need if you're mainly trying to address the first bullet in the considerations above, is that if you just need to block access, if you set up your security in your host site, which I'll do shortly in the demo, that will protect access to your Silverlight app, and the Silverlight app itself can be ignorant of the fact that there's any security going on at all. But often you need to go a step beyond that to really address the third bullet in the considerations. The Silverlight app itself has to have some client-side security context, and that's what's kind of missing in Silverlight. Silverlight itself doesn't natively have anything on the client side that knows about security. If you're a seasoned .NET programmer and you've messed around with security in other arenas, you'll be familiar with the fact that the thread object has a current principle on it in the full framework. And anywhere you are in a normal .NET app, you can just say thread.currentPrincipal, and you'll be able to see if there's an authenticated identity. In Silverlight, that doesn't even exist. They don't have a current principle. There is no direct support for the iPrincipal interface in the Silverlight framework itself. So that's where RIA Services can step in and provide some client-side framework for that stuff, and we'll see that shortly. But for the service security, I skipped over that bullet. Basically, when you go to call out to a service, you got to pass some credentials because there's no presumption that that service necessarily is part of the same hosting web app. It could be, and as you'll see when it is part of the hosting web app, it makes things really easy. But if you go out to some other service outside of your host, then you're going to have to pass some credentials, and those are, again, typically Windows or username are the most common cases, but certainly if you're using WCF, there are all kinds of different custom scenarios you can get into with federated or even custom credentials. So focusing on the more native security of Silverlight as a starting point here, the web host itself, again, can provide the security in the form of Windows or forms authentication. If it's Windows, it's all just kind of magic. It happens at a Windows networking level. You just configure in your web.config file that you want to do Windows authentication, which we'll see shortly, and the browser itself will be picking up the process identity of the interactive user and can pass that along using Windows networking protocols of NTLM or Kerberos. So it doesn't demo very well because it just happens and it's all transparent. The main thing I'm going to be focusing on is showing you how to configure the forms authentication side of things so that you can have more control over those credentials, and it will also work across firewalls that typically will block those Windows protocols. So when you use forms auth, really the way the credentials are being passed, as you may be aware, is through cookies. And so a secure session is established, credentials are passed through the cookie, and a secure token is passed back and forth to keep the secure session alive in a cookie. And this is all stuff that's been around in ASP.NET for a long time, and Silverlight just leverages that fact. To decide whether the credentials provided are valid or not and what roles that user might be associated with, the standard security infrastructure for this has become the membership and role providers. And if you haven't ever configured that stuff yourself, I'm going to do a real quick bootstrapping on that as I get into the demo here. But membership and role providers are referred to as the ASP.NET providers. They've been around since .NET 2.0, and really the ASP.NET team sort of overachieved and created what has become the standard security lookup infrastructure for .NET in general. It's not only used by ASP.NET, you can use it in WPF, you can use it in Windows Forms, and WCF itself uses it as well. So it's very flexible and easy to configure, as you'll see. If you're not familiar with that structure, as I get into the demo, you'll see the world is divided into membership and roles. And membership corresponds to authentication, which means who is the user and do I trust they are who they say they are. And roles, which is more the authorization side, meaning now that I know who the user is, what am I going to allow them to do? And built into the .NET framework at the bottom tier here, there are a number of providers that derive from these role providers and membership providers. The main one I'm going to be using today is the SQL Server one. That gives you the most flexibility because you can define your own users and roles and associate them with your application. But there are other built-in providers that tie into the Windows credentials as well. So with that, let's just jump into the demo here. What I'm going to be using for a demo today is a solution that it's already got a bunch of stuff in it, but we'll kind of progressively bring pieces in as we talk about the different concepts. So for the first demo here, I'm just focusing on forget RIA services exists. What can I do to just kind of block access to my application? Now, functionally, what I've got here is just a standard Silverlight project, Silverlight application project started with a web host here that's the active project. Like I said, it's got a number of things in it, but for now, all we really have is the fact that it's set up as the host site, so it has the ZAP file, the compiled Silverlight application, and it has a web config. So all the other stuff you can ignore for right now. And if we want to go and start securing things, if we wanted to do it on Windows, we would just go into the system.web namespace and say our authentication mode is Windows. And at that point, it would be able to gather the client identity from the process of the browser and transfer that back and forth. If we did that, we would probably want to block access to unauthorized users. So we would also bring in this section, the authorization section, which says deny ? Means anonymous, and that blocks any unauthorized users. They have to first authenticate. As soon as you do that, it's going to want to pass the Windows credentials. What we're going to focus on, though, is what if I don't want to do it based on Windows? I want to control my own users and roles in a database typically. So then I would switch my mode to forms here. And at that point, it's going to want to kick the user over to a login form as soon as they hit the site. Any file on the site, any address on the site, it's going to say first you have to be authenticated, and it's going to try to redirect them to a login.aspx page by default. In here you can see I'm using the built-in ASP.NET login control, just a very simple, crude login control, and it ties in directly with the membership and role providers we'll be talking about. So that's what's going to do our initial authentication. Now, when it does that, it's going to use the default membership and default role providers. And you can see I have some commented out sections down here to customize those, but it's just kind of on by default as far as membership is concerned. But the role provider you do have to enable by setting it to true. And at that point what happens is you can see a connection string up here named local SQL server. Those built-in providers are designed to use the SQL provider by default, and it is looking for a SQL connection string named local SQL server. There is one of these tied in down at your machine.config level that does kind of automatic creation of a SQL Express database. To sort of turn that functionality off and have direct control over it here, what I'm doing is removing the one that comes up from my machine.config and tying in my own that points to a database called ASP.NET DB. Now what that database is one that you can create very quickly on the fly. What I'm going to do here is go into my C Windows Microsoft.NET Framework 64, and you can go into Framework as well if you have a 64-bit machine, and then the version of .NET you're using. And under there's a utility called ASP.NET Reg SQL. So I'll run that real quick. It's a simple wizard. If you just go through the defaults, next, 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 what it's creating is a database called ASP.NET DB. And it fully provisions that database with the schema that the membership and role providers, as well as the profile provider that I'll touch on later, are expecting. So at this point, this is a valid connection string to that database. Now, when you first create it like that, this thing is empty, so I'm going to have to go ahead and create some users in there. So I'll quickly go into my project menu, ASP.NET configuration, and once this starts up here, I'll go to the security. You can see it's already pointing because I have forms authentication in my web config. It knows that, and it's actually looking at that database, and right now we have no users or roles. So I'll go ahead and create a user real quick. And it does enforce strong passwords here, so I'm going to do a fairly strong demo password. And then it does do some regex type validation, so it looks like an email and a question here, and I'll create the user. Okay, if you've used this tool this tool is a little cumbersome at times, and it doesn't fully expose the capabilities of the membership and role providers. So in the demos for this session, I've got another utility we've written at iDesign called our Credential Manager, and I've got this actually already fired up here. This is a smart client using WCF Services so that you can have remote administration of that database. And this thing will start up, and it's just a simple little Windows Forms app we wrote. You can see the copyright here back in 2005 when this stuff was all first coming out. And it just puts a little Windows interface on this that lets you manage roles, passwords, credentials, service, reset passwords, and things that that other built-in tool doesn't provide. So here you can see there's that Brian user that I just created. I can use this or the built-in web-based tool to create some roles here. So I'll create a role called Manager. And I'll also create a role called Admin. And then I can assign my users by having them selected on both sides here. I can assign to Admin and assign to Manager. And at this point, the Brian user is mapped into both of those roles. So that's another tool that will be in the demo code that you can play around with and use to administer your store. So now that I have those users, if I go ahead and fire up my demo, just based on, again, to recap, all I did was said authentication mode forms and authorization deny anonymous users. And at this point, I can go ahead and fire up the app. And you'll see I've got a main page that just has a very crude, simple little banner at the top once we get to it. But before I can even get to it, it does a redirect here. And I'll expand the address here so you can see up at the top. It's got the login ASPX with a return URL. And I put in my Brian user and my password that I just created and say login, and at this point it makes a round trip to the server, passes the authentication. Now a secure session has been established and it's round tripping cookies on every HTTP request to that site, and you can see the little My App banner up here, and if I resize things a little bit you can see there's a little progress bar down here that we'll use in a moment. So at this point I haven't done anything really fancy or special. I'm just using the host security to block access. I'm using the default SQL Server provider for membership to do the authentication. And you can see it's just a tiny bit of config, and I have a fully secured app. What I'm missing at this point is the fact that the services I call out to, if they're HTTP services, they can still be authenticated with that same secure session if they're on the same host site. But what I'm really missing is any kind of client-side security context, and that's where I said there's nothing built in to help you there in RIA Services, or I'm sorry, in Silverlight itself. So that's where RIA Services comes in. To give the big picture here, what is WCF RIA Services for those that are new to it? RIA Services is mostly about building multi-tier line of business applications, and really mostly about working with data very simple in those applications. It's about pushing and pulling entities from the client to the server side and having some shared logic, business logic, validation logic between the client and server side, and also just making it really easy to make service calls to your hosting website services without having to do a lot of plumbing code for WCF itself. So if you come in and think of your application in two-tier terms like the diagram shows there, you can think of it as RIA Services slips in between the presentation and the business layers some pipeline, some service-based plumbing that lets you transfer entities back and forth, invoke validation, and make your service calls. That's RIA Services as a whole. It mainly applies to Silverlight, a little bit to ASP.NET at the current time, and even more so in a future release they're going to be targeting client-side JavaScript in the same way that Silverlight is currently targeted. So that's kind of the big picture on what RIA Services is. If you need more background on that, I've got a link at the end to my 10-part series on the Silverlight Show. There's also a couple other webinars I've done that you can go see the recorded versions of for querying and updating data and doing validation with RIA Services. Now, in terms of the context of this talk, the security features of RIA Services are really separable but complementary to the rest of what RIA Services does. So even if you look at the rest of what RIA Services does and you go, yeah, I'm fine with normal WCF and maybe calling out to other services I don't control, so RIA Services is not a play, you can still leverage the RIA Services security features I'll show here to get a secured session established either from a hosting web page like I just showed, or logging in within the client application itself once Silverlight starts up. You can also share that security with your RIA services and with other WCF services you call out to. You still get to leverage the rich features of the membership role and profile providers. And the biggest thing is the kind of middle bullets here is that you do get a fully populated client-side security context that you can then use to customize the application. So basically what you end up doing, and you'll see in the demo here, is you're just going to add a new class to your hosting website called an authentication domain service. The default base class for that provides pretty much everything you need except for customization scenarios, and for those custom scenarios there's good extensibility on that type for you to be able to do more fancy things, let's say, with your security if you really need to. On the client side, you're going to get code generated for you, a thing called a web context, and that gives you that client-side security information available. To get that thing populated, you're either going to do an explicit login from the Silverlight app with a dialog, or you can just join the security context to your hosting website with a load call, as you'll see. And once you've done that, you're kind of up and running with RIA Service Security. So to do this, all I would do is I'll drop back into demo mode here, and I'll go into the web app itself. And what I've already done this, but just to show you the path to it, I would say add a new item. I would go to the web category, and then you'll see that there is a template here for an authentication domain service. And if I add this in just so you can see the default structure of it, it's a class that derives from authentication base of T, where T is a user type derived from user base. And this, basically the default here that it generates, the empty classes, is all you really need for 90% of the scenarios. The base class does everything you need. You just need to have it there in your client's or your server project, and then you'll get some client-side code generated that you can use on the client side. So I'm going to delete that one off because I already have one, and the one that I have away. The one that I'm going to keep here is an override of a method called getAuthenticated_user that happens after the authentication happens, and it's going to populate this thing called a user object. I'm doing this mostly just so that I can simulate, a normal service call that might take a little bit, and to show that there are some lifetime aspects you have to deal with on the client side when that's the case. So I'm just going to put a little thread sleep here of 3 seconds into the authentication process to delay things. But otherwise, you can see here I've got a user class derived from user base. This property I'll get to when I get to the personalization portions, but basically it's saying that you can add additional properties that will be transferred to the client side for customization purposes. So once that thing is in your server side, all you need to do is build. So I'll press the build button here, and what happens in that process, whenever RIA Services does its work, you define things on the server side and you get some code-generated counterparts in the client side. And so up here in my client project, when I show all files, we've got a generated code folder that shows up, and inside of that are a number of types. Now, some of this has to do with, I'll show later in the demo, tying into normal RIA services, but let's just focus on the security part of it. For that my authentication domain service that I defined, I get a corresponding domain context class. And this is sort of the client-side proxy that lets you get to that service. Now, you won't normally have to directly interact with this thing. It's just there as part of the infrastructure and will be called automatically by a separate type that's code-generated called the web context. This is the main thing you're going to interact with in your code to get to the security context to log in users and so on, and you'll see that code shortly. But those get code-generated based on the fact that this class, my authentication domain service, is here in the web project. And also when I created this app, there's a step where the dialog comes up when you're first creating it saying, do you want to create a host website? And there's a checkbox for enable WCF RIA services. If you forget that checkbox, it just corresponds to this setting, WCF RIA services link, in the properties of your Silverlight app. And so you can set that after the fact if it ends up as no project set and point to your website. That's what enables the code generation that I was talking about. And so once we have that web context on the client side now, we can go ahead and first we could join the security context or bring the security context to the client side that already exists in our hosting website. Because if you remember right now, we're secured with forms authentication being redirected to that login page to establish the secure session. But if I want to transfer that security information to the client side, what I can do is I'll drop into, well, first place I'm going to go is to app.xaml code behind. And what you have to do is initialize your web context. So there's really 3 lines of code here that you'll need after you initialize your app, where you construct a web context and you choose what form of authentication you're using, and there's built-in types for forms authentication and Windows authentication. Once you've populated that, you add it to your application lifetime objects, and that makes it available as a singleton throughout the application. So that's kind of the initialization of the web context and getting it ready to talk to the back end. You can see we're not directly interacting with the authentication domain context. We just work with the web context itself. Then what I can do is I'm going to bring in a loaded event handler here. It says if we've got a secured host, meaning the host website sets up the secure session, and we just want to get that information to the client side, we can go through that authentication object on the web context.current and just call load user. That's going to be a non-blocking asynchronous call. All service calls in Silverlight have to be asynchronous, and so that's going to go retrieve the user information back onto the client side. Now the trick here is because it's asynchronous, that means if we need to do other things in the app based on the security context, we've got to wait till that call is complete. And so that will force you to structure your app a little bit differently. What I've got here structurally in the client side, you can see I've got this main page that is mainly just kind of an empty shell with a banner at the top and a crude status bar at the bottom. And what I'm going to do is I've got a content control sitting in the main content area there that I'm going to dynamically put content into once I have my security context available and can use that to drive the rest of the application. So that secured context that I'm going to pop in is a user control here with various form controls on it that we'll look at what each of those do as we get into it here. But I want to defer constructing and loading this until I know the security context is available, just to simplify the code that supports this view. So going back to the code behind then, we make that asynchronous non-blocking call. We subscribe to a completed event, which will fire immediately if it's already completed by the time this line of code executes in a multi-threaded environment. And I've just got some support code down here that's going to basically, when I first go into that, you see above that I show login in progress. That's just going to show a progress bar spinning and put some text in the status bar down there. And then when login's done, I turn off the progress bar in the text. So that's all that's going on in those methods. So once the login's done, and then I can pop my secured content, construct it, and know that everything behind that view, including I'm not doing MVVM here, but if I was doing view models and services and things like that, I would be able to know that once that's constructed, my authentication is already set up so I can do secured stuff in that view. So with that much code there, I am able to go ahead and run this thing again. And it will still force me to log in through the hosting web page and the login page here. So I'll put in my credentials again and log in. I get redirected. Now down at the bottom you see loading security context for a few seconds there. That was because of that thread sleep, because I intentionally blocked just so that you could see some progress and see that there is a disconnect in time here. Could be, a noticeable disconnect in time to the user. And so you have to accommodate that in the way that you construct and fill out the rest of your application. But now that it's here, you can see up at the top I've got a Brian up here. It's saying, some customization in the UI. The entire form here doesn't show up until I know that I've been authenticated. I can click on this button and it's going to execute some functionality that I'll show the code for is restricted by role to managers. I can make a WCF service call out to a normal WCF service that is authenticating as well. and that call goes through fine. And actually, if we look down here in the output window, I'm dumping with the debug write line in the WCF service. You can see that the authenticated identity did flow into that service from the client app. And then over here, the data that's showing up down in this grid is actually a RIA service call that's retrieving the data and populating the grid, and that too is enabled for authentication. So you have security throughout, both in the loading of the app, the personalization of the app, role-based functionality in the client side, and authentication and authorization in the services it calls out to. Now, if you want to have a more explicit login inside of your Silverlight app and not rely on the host website, let me just show what that would look like. Is I can switch to a different loaded function here. And in this case, what we're going to do is pop a login dialog on the client side. And this is just a simple little child window that will pop up as a username and password input and a login button. And that's going to need to make an explicit call to pass those credentials to the back end, get them validated, and then return not only that they were authenticated, but also the security context to the client. So in the code behind of this little login form, you'll see the code required for that. You use the same webcontext.current.authentication, and then just call a login method instead of a load user method. So this presumes there is not necessarily already a security context, and you want to establish one, and you're going to pass the username and password that you've gathered from the user. It's another non-blocking asynchronous call, so you have to wait for completion. And then down here I'm just doing some kind of management that basically says if login failed, keep the dialog there until they succeed. A very crude login experience here, but it basically says they can't go any further until they've completed login. And so with that in place on the client side, the other change I'll want to make here is if I run this right now, I've got a problem in that it's still going to want to redirect me to the login page before it can download the page that the Silverlight app is on. So when you're doing Silverlight authentication like this instead of the host authentication, you're typically going to have to turn off, at least for the hosting page itself and for the zap file that's in the client bin directory over here, you're going to have to make those unauthenticated access. In other words, let anonymous users in. So I'll comment out this authorization section, and the rest of our site is now unprotected, which we would have to deal with separately. But as far as our Silverlight app, anyone can get to it, but the Silverlight app itself is going to enforce the security and gather the user credentials. We still leave it to forms authentication as our basis of that. So now when I run the app, it'll start up here and we'll see that little child window will pop up first thing. It will gather my same credentials and make a service call when I click the login button, and it's going to stay in the dialog until that service call is complete, which has the same 3-second delay. It's calling the same chunk of code. And then you can see we're right back into the secured application with all its functionality. So that's how you can easily embed the login functionality directly into the client application. So let me jump back to the slides for a moment. And the next thing I want to show briefly is that now we've got this established security context. Actually, let me go back to the demo. I forgot to show one other important part here, is the authorization side of things. So the authentication is simply either load user from that one loaded event that I showed before, where we made a webcontext.current.authentication.load user call to retrieve an existing security context provided by the host. And if we log in inside of the app, then it's just doing the login form stuff, which was a login call. That gets the security context established. Once you have an authenticated user, it also, if you have the role provider configured, meaning role manager enabled equals true in the web config, then you can do authorization. So in the code behind of this secured content user control, you can see I've got a couple of things going on. One is, as it loads up, I can just say webcontext.current.user.isInRole and do a role check here. And so you can see that in the structure of this view, you saw some super secret admin functionality was in the user interface there. Let me go back to the UI so you can see it there. You can see this little grid here has super secret admin stuff that only admins should see. And so you can just simply turn that on and off by doing a role check on the client side and then doing things like setting visibility of functionality or maybe disabling menus and toolbar buttons and that kind of thing. And likewise down below for that button I was clicking for manager functionality, I can do some gate checking here and make sure they're in the manager role before they try to execute that functionality. So that's all there is to using roles to enable, disable, and modify functionality on the client side. All right, so now back to the slides. And going beyond that, so one form of personalization, if you will, is just simply knowing the identity of the user so they could put Brian in the screen there. You know, a second form is doing more role-based authorization to turn on and off functionality. And then a third form of personalization is actually having some user preference type information that you want to load and store on a per user basis. This is also incredibly easy to do here with the RIA Services infrastructure and the profile provider. It's kind of a third sibling of the membership and role providers. And you just set this up in your web config settings. You define properties on that user type that's associated with your authentication domain service, and it just works from there. And yet you do have to set those properties on the client side if the user can customize them and save the changes. So let's look at that code in the demo. So kind of from the bottom up here, if we look at it, if I want to do this stuff, the built-in functionality in RIA Services is based on the profile provider. That's just another section here in your web.config file that you turn on. You set profile enabled to true. And then you have a properties section where you're really just declaring named properties. At this level, they don't have to have any type with them, but they can still be strongly typed in the code once you actually use them. So in this case, I've just got a single personalization option for setting a favorite color here. The next step is to associate that property with your strongly typed user object. And if you remember, that was over here in our authentication domain service, the declared user type that derives from user base. You can just declare simple, strongly typed properties on that user type. And when the code generation happens on the client side, if I go back into my client-side code-generated folder here, you'll see that one of the types code generated over here is that same user type, and it does have properties on it for things like favorite color, and they get declared as just properties on the class. So if I want to use that in the code of the application now, I just have to access those properties on the user object, and you've already seen that the user object is always accessible to you through webcontext.current.user. So down below here you can see there's a call to personalize the color. Several methods here that are just kind of grungy color manipulation type stuff, not specific to security at all, working with rectangles and text boxes and doing some type conversion type stuff to input a string and turn that into a color. So the exposed functionality here, if I run the app again, is I can get it loaded up here, type in my credentials, wait for the 3 seconds, which I could probably take out at this point because you get the idea. And you can see this little favorite color here. And if I type in, I'm doing some type conversion on the string, and you can see the rectangle fills in with blue. And then if I call, I believe it's the doManager function is the one that's saving, it actually does a save there and persists it to the back end. And if I refresh the application at this point and get it all loaded up with fresh context, we should see that that user preference was persisted and is retrieved on loading the application again, so it's still set to blue. Now the code that supports that is mostly just accessing the webcontext.current.user.favoriteColor property in this case, or any other properties you expose, and setting an appropriate value on that strongly typed property. The only other part here that I implicitly did when I clicked that button was you can see that, let me find the right method here. Where is our manager functionality? Oh, there it is. This is the only other call to be aware of, is that when you have modified those properties for the user on the client side, you've got to get those transmitted and persisted on the back end, and that's just another non-blocking asynchronous call called save user on the authentication service, and you pass a flag of true there, basically telling it whether you want to have an error thrown if it fails or not. You can just silently fail to persist their changes, but it's usually better to throw an exception. Now, the way this is structured, it would throw an unhandled exception and crash the app. So with any RIA Services asynchronous method like this, you'll want to either subscribe to the completed event, or you can pass a callback reference through a delegate and handle errors in the callback. So that's all there is to personalization. Jumping back to the slides for a moment, two more aspects to cover. One is, what if I do normal RIA service calls, doing entity-based data access and persistence and validation inside my application? How does that tie in with this mechanism? Well, the calls are already being secured in this case, whether you do it with the host or you authenticate from the client. It does establish a normal cookie-based secure session with that site, and every round trip via HTTP to that site will carry the cookies along. Now, one caveat I should mention here, if you're not aware, Silverlight has a browser stack for communication and a client stack for communication. The browser is the default, and it's the thing that's doing this automatic round tripping of cookies that I'm talking about. If you switch your Silverlight app to the client stack, that won't happen automatically. You will have to set up a cookie container, and there's a post by Kyle McClellan from the WCF RIA Services team about going out of browser with WCF RIA Services that talks about how to set up that cookie container for yourself. And if anyone needs to track that down, you can just shoot me an email or a tweet. But so using the browser stack, the cookies will automatically be round tripped. And as a result, when calls go into a normal RIA Services domain service, it is actually passing those credentials. Then it just becomes a question of, are you going to require credentials to get into the service or not? If you are, it's simply a matter of adding some attributes to your service. A requires authentication attribute to block access to the service unless they're authenticated, and a requires role attribute to indicate that they should not be able to get to a certain method without a certain role being associated with them. And if you need to do more fine-grained programmatic role checks and logic, then you can capture the user principal that's established when the secure call comes in and use that throughout the service. So what that looks like in code, I'll switch back over here. Now you saw that there was some task data being loaded up in that secured content user control. What that's using is a normal WCF RIA Services domain service here that's using some task data. I won't go through the full details of this. You can check out the other webinar on querying and updating data with RIA Services to get the full gist. But you can see that I'm calling a getTask method here. And first I mark my service itself, the whole service, which requires authentication, and it will deny access to the service unless there's an established authenticated session. It doesn't have to know what the form of that session is, whether it's Windows or Forms. That's all done through configuration. It just says make sure that they're authenticated before they call this. And then if I want to do role checks on individual methods, I just use this requires role and indicate the name of the role, and it will go do a lookup through the role provider to ensure that the authenticated user is in that role before it lets them into this method. If I want to do more fine-grained checking, down here I'm just doing a check and saying I want to check that they're in the manager role when they update a task, and in this case I'm just doing a debug write line, but you can imagine saying something like only managers can update tasks for anyone, but a given user can update tasks just for themselves. And you would do that kind of programmatic is in role check like I'm showing here. To do that, you do have to do one other step, is you have to capture the principal as I mentioned in the slide, and I show here at the top all that requires is an override on your base class with an initialize method, and you get this thing passed in called a domain service context. That domain service context has a user principal object on it just like the client side has, so we can just hold on to that as an iPrincipal. That's the interface that defines the is in role check, and then we have it accessible to us throughout the service. And that's all that's required on the server side with the RIA service to secure it and do role checks within the service. If you are calling out to normal WCF services, what's the story there? Well, with normal WCF services, for those that have been exposed, there is a big, deep, vast world of security that WCF itself supports. This is just a small subset of that because Silverlight itself with WCF doesn't support the full realm of all those various kinds of credentials and transport versus message and lots of other variations there. So for this scenario, if you stick to the easiest but secure path, all you need is a WCF service that has ASP.NET compatibility requirements enabled. This is something you enable on the host and the service, and I'll show the code here in a moment. That basically means it can support cookies and more of a ASP.NET style secure session. And you'll still need the standard host configuration to say how you're going to look up your credentials, whether it's Windows or Forms based. And then you'll want to stick to the basic HTTP binding, which has a default security mode of none, which may seem kind of counterintuitive here. It is saying that as far as the service itself is concerned, you are completely unsecured. But as you'll see here, it's very easy to do those checks inside of the service to ensure that only secure access happens. The reason for the none setting is that the basic HTTP binding only supports transport level security mechanisms that are really enforced by IIS. And if you do it out in IIS, then there's no security context provided down into your service itself. So this kind of lets it pass through the gateway of IIS down into the ASP.NET arena, down into your WCF service, and then you have a point of enforcement inside the WCF service. But the information, the context of that security flows all the way through that path. It's just not being validated at any of those other steps. So what this looks like, if we go back over to our demo, is I will go to a WCF service. I've got a simple out-of-the-box add new project WCF service library here. I named it WCF Services, and it's got the stock iService one that is created by the template here with the get data method is the one that I'm calling from the client. I've got that configured. Down in here, first off, let me find the right line here, sorry. The first thing is the service itself. Well, it would help if I'm looking at the right config file. Sorry about that. I need to look at the web config. This library is referenced from the hosting website. So the host for the service will need to be the same site, or you're going to be talking a separate security session anyway. But if it is hosted in the same site, and we go down to our system.service model section, what you need is this service hosting environment and set ASP.NET compatibility enabled to true. That says as far as the host is concerned, it can do that ASP.NET secure session stuff. Then on the service itself, you put a similar attribute called ASP.NET compatibility requirements. Requirements mode is required or allowed are the two values that would work here. And that just says let that cookie stuff flow down into the service so I can use it for authentication in the service. Then the other thing I'm doing here is in the service constructor, it does not automatically establish the authenticated user as the principal on the thread, but you can do that with a single line of code here. In your constructor, you can just transfer the HTTP context.current.user, which is a principal, into the thread.principal. And then all the subsequent methods in the service that get called will have that same secure context, only for that one user that's calling. Now you have to be careful about this line of code if you're in a singleton. This will only work if you're in a per call or per session kind of WCF mode. But at that point you can see I can access the current principal. I'm outputting it to the console here saying what the authenticated identity is. And I could even, once I've established that thread principal, I could do role-based authentication with something like a principal permission attribute, if I could spell it, and get it all case sensitive so that it resolves here. That's in the security permissions namespace, and you can do this thing, and then you can do a role check by saying security action.demand role equals manager, and it will do the same kind of role checks I was talking about in the RIA service. And at that point, I can go ahead and run this thing, and you'll see the output window once I get to that point. Probably should have removed the thread sleep, but we can wait 3 seconds here. Just put in my creds again, log in, wait 3 seconds, and then if you watch at the bottom of the screen here, you can see There's the domain service context identity because of the retrieval of the tasks. And then when I press the button for the service call, whoops, wrong browser, press the call service 1 here and look at the output window again, we'll see WCF authenticated identity is also the same security context. So pretty straightforward, easy to use there as long as you stick to the main path. Now there are lots of other crazy combinations you can get into with custom credential types and using basic security and all kinds of other things, but if you want a simple, seamless way to go about it, just take a look at the demo code and walk through it again. It's mainly forms authentication, basic HTTP binding defaults, and use the ASP.NET compatibility requirements and host it on the same site, and it's fully secured calls into the service. So with that, I'm going to wrap up here and take some Q&A. A few resources to point you to. My full series, a 10-part series on RIA services, is at this URL here. If you want to focus just on the security aspects, part 7 of that series is on authentication and authorization. Another one, the credentials manager that I showed, I've got a link to that, but it'll also be in the demos that you can use to administer your membership and role providers. So with that, I'm going to pop over to the management console here and start taking some questions.
Okay, Brian, thanks for the beautiful presentation, and it was very detailed, and honestly it was perfect since I cannot see any questions for our attendees. Maybe we should wait for a minute or two to see whether there are some questions or not. Alrighty. Okay, and the first one is is coming. Let me send it to you.
Alrighty.
Can you see the questions?
I see question coming. Let me see here. Got a questions panel, but nothing else other than your question coming there.
Okay, let me try send you another one then. Okay.
There we go. Hoping to discuss Windows authentication with custom roles. Okay. I could talk about that briefly. So I'll actually go back here to the demo to talk about that. If you were going to do Windows authentication with custom roles, you can mix and match these things very easily. What you would end up doing, let me get to my system.web section here, I would change my authentication mode to Windows, and I would leave role manager enabled equals true. That's going to use the default SQL Server role provider, but the authentication now will be based on Windows credentials. Now the one thing you'll have to do in this case is you still need a user defined in the role database, because it's going to be basically making a call to the role database to say, here's the authenticated user identity, what are the roles associated with them. So what I would have to do at that point, I can just fire up my credential service here or use the built-in tool. I just find it a little bit easier to work with and more flexible. Just a little slower to start though. And I will define a new user once this starts up that is my fully qualified domain identity. So in this case I'm using a local machine workgroup configuration, and I would create a new user called Brian-E6500 is my machine name, / Brian Noyes is my Windows identity. Password and all that, I can just say generate here because I'm never going to use the password. I'm not actually authenticating against this database. I'm really just putting the username in there as a key to drive roles off of. And I will have to complete a couple other things here to make the validation happy and create the user. Once that's in there, I can go into my roles and map admin and manager roles into that user, and it's going to use those for lookups. And at this point, the login dialog is really irrelevant. It will, you know, I can actually go comment that out, but I'll just kind of click past it or just get running here on the right project. Okay, so we're already running. Let's just start it over here since we've changed configuration. And basically at this point it should be picking up the process identity from the browser, automatically transferring that, or the server really is going to demand authentication with some extra HTTP messages. I'll just put in credentials here just since I didn't comment everything out. It's still going to, see, it's failing for that, but if I put in my real Windows authentication information now, okay, it's going to do the call here, and I may still be blocked the way this is wired up, but I'd have to go comment out the login dialog there. But the answer to the question is basically mode equals Windows for authentication, establish a username for each Windows identity that you want in your role database, and map roles into that, and it's still going to work just fine. It'll just go to Windows for the authentication, into the role manager for the authorization parts. All right, let me go back to the panel here. Any other questions? Let's see here. Often asked is a mix of ASP.NET Security login and custom login depending on users. I guess it depends on what you mean by custom login. It's a little hard to infer. Custom means many things to many people as well. If you're talking about custom credential types, as opposed to using Windows or username password based authentication, there are hooks that you could leverage for that, but really, to be honest, if I'm going outside of the Windows or forms-based, username password-based forms of authentication, I'm not so sure that WCF RIA Services buys you a whole lot at that point. You're almost better off just exposing a WCF service using the full range of credential types and things that WCF is capable of, and doing the authentication in the WCF service. The way I look at RIA Services is it's a really fast, streamlined, but clean architecture pipeline for doing what it's good at. As soon as you start trying to go too custom with it, then you may end up doing as much work to customize it as writing something from scratch yourself with more direct means like WCF itself. All right, let me pop out this question panel so I have a little more room to work. Let's see, next one here. Entity framework. How does Entity framework work with the ASP.NET DB? Well, the database that was created when I went through that wizard, the ASP.NET _regSQL.exe that's down in your Microsoft.NET directories, that thing is really just running some scripts to provision the database with a known schema and a known set of stored procedures that the built-in SQL provider is going against. But there's nothing, magic beyond that. You can call directly into that database yourself and set fields and stuff as long as you maintain the consistency of the database. You can go look at some of those stored procedures and see if they give you what you need. Or as the question is asking here, you could potentially put an entity framework model directly on top of those tables and modify the data directly that way. But it's more just that the built-in provider is doing some standard queries through stored procedures to get to the users table, the roles table. It does have a relation to an applications table because you can partition your users and roles per app and have one database supporting multiple apps with different people in each app. So that you have to get to know that schema a little bit if you're going to do that, but there's nothing wrong with going directly to that database. And you can even add custom columns to the user table or things like that if you needed to. All right, let's see here. Oh, so that was Ward asking me the custom login. Ward, good to see you. So if you have a follow-on there, Ward, about the specific custom scenario you were asking about, I'd be glad to do a follow-on there. Ward also has another question that says to block anonymous with the internal login, I guard the service with those requires auth attributes, correct? That is correct. So if you just do a normal domain service in RIA Services, it is unauthenticated by default, and you do have to put the requires authentication attribute on it to force authentication before it dispatches the calls into the service class. And that's just the way it works on the RIA Services side. And because of the way the cookie infrastructure works with WCF, the same is really true of the WCF service as well, that the WCF service is really unauthenticated at a service class level, but it does pass the credential and the security context into the service, so you can drive your own authentication and authorization based off of that. And then one more here, and then we got to wrap up. Can I protect WCF services using the authorization web config to disable access? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. In my project here, you can see that the real hosting of the WCF service is this service1.svc file. It is just a file as far as IIS and ASP.NET is concerned. and the calls are being dispatched to it. So if you block access to that SVC file with an authorization section in your web config, that is another more host-based way to secure access to your service. And the last question here from Ward, just a real quick one, is how do you control access to the ZAP? What do I recommend there? It depends on whether you're going to do the Silverlight authentication or the host authentication. If it's host authentication, then lock down access to it, authenticate outside the Silverlight app, and then only allow the redirect or the download of that ZAP file to happen once you're authenticated. But if you want to do it inside of the Silverlight app, it's obviously got to be downloaded and lit up before you collect those credentials and establish the secure session, so you'll have to leave unguarded access to your ZAP file. So with that, Ivan, back over to you.
Yeah, thanks for this webinar, Brian. There are a few more questions that will be answered in the next 2 days. We'll reply them personally via email. A recording of this webinar, as well as all demos and slides, will be made available to you, and email it within the next 2 days. To all our attendees, please help us improve a little bit SilverlightShow webinar by filling our short survey displayed just in a minute. Thanks for attending, and have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.